In the past, military attacks have come by land, by sea, or by air. But in the age of the internet, the battlefield may be digital. This week on Dialogue, cyber warfare, national security in the information age. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guest this week is Matt Fusa. Matt is a managing attorney with Cisco Systems, Inc., where he serves as legal counsel to the company's Global Government Solutions Group. He recently completed a term as Cisco Fellow here at the Wilson Center, and previously he served as an officer in the United States Marine Corps, and we're happy to have him with us. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Let's begin with some definitional discussion. Let's not assume everyone is expert in this area. And define what are the areas of concern when we talk cybersecurity?
Well, I mean, I think that today the news is showing us how many there are. So it's less of a question of how many, but it's really, first, I think the starting point is, what's the domain? What is cyberspace is really, I think, the question. And, cyberspace, there's a surprising debate on what the proper definition is, but essentially it is all the interconnected systems, all the interconnected computer systems that comprise what most users today think of as the internet. But in this day and age, it increasingly incorporates the mobile phones that all of us carry in our pockets, our smartphones, our iPads, our other portable devices.
Is it any form of electronic telecommunication device?
Not any form of so a traditional wired telephone would probably not be, exactly, would not be something that we would really think of as being in cyberspace, but increasingly...
Certainly a smartphone, though, is...
Certainly a smartphone, and increasingly people in their own homes are using voice over IP technology, which is really telephone by internet. And I think what you're seeing is the domain of cyberspace is expanding and it is not shrinking. And it's expanding through the use of new technologies, new hardware, and it's everything from the consumer to the business to governments around the world adopting these technologies for whatever their needs are.
And an area that I didn't really think about until I was preparing to interview you today is things like hardware and software. We're thinking of the internet and the communication that flies all around the globe minute by minute, but also the devices, a flash drive, a new program that you're loading. All of these are in the area of security concerns.
They do. They make up the system that we would consider to be cyberspace. And the hardware is the tangible item you can hold in your hand, and the software applications are, I think, to most users, and are the things that make all those devices run and function. And increasingly we're seeing a move toward cloud systems, which are really
Define a cloud system. What is the difference between a cloud system and a normal operating system?
In a normal operating system, take for example, your typical user. You have a laptop computer. The software that you use, the applications that you run, are loaded on that computer.
It's right there on that hard drive.
That's right. And so you're pulling your primary applications right off the hard drive. In a cloud-based system, it's really more of like a subscriber model. And the software that runs your system, the application you want to run, is no longer going to be on your computer. It's going to be in a cloud. And a cloud is really just a series of globally dispersed data centers that are these massive data centers that run hosts of applications. They run them for businesses, they run them for individuals, they store data, and they provide applications to users who access them through the internet. And I think it's fair to say that there will be, both in business and in personal use, a significant increase is forecast in the use of these data centers and of cloud systems. And that includes initiatives really since the Obama administration came into office by the U.S. federal government to look at and adapt cloud technologies where they make sense.
Again, generally speaking, what are the current levels of threats and attacks that take place in any given day? We were talking a bit about that before we began taping, just in using your own home computer and all the virus threats that are out there, and email scams and other. What about when we're talking about military computers or major private sector industry computers?
Well, I think the range of threats is substantial, and I think it's first important to talk about where the threats emanate from, and it is it's you'll see today if you read the paper, the cyber attacks that are related to WikiLeaks. And there what you see are what are called hacktivists. These are
Hacktivists.
Hacktivists, yes. These are
Good word.
These are globally linked through Twitter and through other communication technologies, activists who have in their mind a cause, and they're using information technology to coordinate efforts to interfere with or crash the websites of companies that they feel are treating WikiLeaks in a way that they don't like.
So they attacked MasterCard recently and Visa.
Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, those are all the latest sort of victims of these, really which are sort of a informal cyber militia that comes together really automatically through things like Twitter and other forms of communication. And so you have those kind of groups. You have the high school student who just wants to see how far they can get into a particular web page. And then there's the hacktivists, which may be a little bit more sophisticated. And then you have criminal enterprises. And I think increasingly the U.S. government and all governments and corporations, and really individuals should be as well, are concerned with criminal enterprises. They're relatively sophisticated. They have resources, and primarily what they're after is data that they can sell, or information that they can use to steal money, and sophisticated hacking attacks against financial institutions in order to simply steal.
Identity theft on the micro level.
Identity theft. But these organizations run from the relatively unsophisticated to the highly sophisticated.
Do we have the means, Matt, to divide that group of threats? Do we know how many or what percentage of the activity might be around a terrorist group or a state actor, or just, like you said, the high school kid who's a prankster, a high-tech prankster?
I think it's fair to say, so there is no hard data that I'm aware of,
right,
as a starting point. And if there is, a lot of a lot of the substantive information relative to cybersecurity and cyber threats is highly classified today. I think it would be fair to say that the vast majority of attacks, and I think that word is overused because cyber attacks, and I'm going to use that word loosely on purpose, but I do think it's overused because, a high school student who's tinkering is not really so much attacking as really engaging in mischief. But I would say the preponderance are of that type, really sort of amateurist nuisance variety. I think there is an increase, though, in sophisticated cyber criminal activities that are targeting primarily financial institutions or anything of value to really just commit crimes. Beyond that, you have recently there's been a series of very interesting disclosures by the Department of Defense. A lot of this is around the creation of U.S. Cyber Command and sort of explaining to the public the purpose behind the creation of U.S. Cyber Command and the notion of cyber warfare, that is specifically protecting the United States, both the U.S. military, U.S. federal government computer systems, and the critical infrastructure of the United States from sophisticated nation-state actors who are engaging in everything from espionage to potentially preparing and testing technology that could be used in the event of warfare, traditional warfare. So the range is huge. And, interestingly, the real world keeps providing real examples of all these ranges of threats to the public. And I think since my time at the Wilson Center, not a month has gone by where there has not been a well-publicized, new and interesting type of cyber, whether it's cyber mischief or cyber attack, the Stuxnet virus being, I think, probably one of the most interesting and really most serious threats that are known to the public today. Now,
you said the word attack is overused, and things like cyber warfare probably drift into the melodramatic as well, but there are significant threats out there. And I guess what I'm asking you to do is, describe a worst-case scenario. I mean, when the threats were, say, nuclear war, we were talking about existential threats. We may not be talking about that here, but there could be significant implications.
Yes, and they've been in the public domain. You can read, for example, you can read about the worst-case scenario could be, and a lot of this revolves around China. China is, I think it's fair to say that China is viewed as a source of significant concern with respect to cybersecurity. And a lot of that has to do with some of the public statements that the Chinese military and the Chinese government make. We have Cyber Command. So we obviously, the United States hasn't really hidden its intention to view cyberspace as a domain of warfare.
But Cyber Command is relatively new.
It is relatively
Spring
new.
Of this year?
The spring of this year, that's correct. And last year, I'm sorry, not last year, but the Chinese have I think, been publicly making statements about using cyberspace as a domain of warfare for a long time. And really, according to the analysts, what happened is they saw the first Gulf War and the United States attacking the Iraqi army and being, I think, surprisingly successful, at least for the Chinese. I think the U.S. military had trained a long time or prepared for that type of conflict. But it was a real wake-up call to the Chinese military in terms of the sophistication and the capabilities of a Western army, particularly the United States. In response to that, it appears that they undertook a detailed study of how they could fight the United States military in a more limited conflict. The typical scenario is around Taiwan. And the fear has always been that Taiwan declares its independence and China undertakes warfare to take Taiwan, and the United States attempts to intervene. That's the frequent scenario that is used to discuss a wide range of scenarios, but in cyber war. And so let me explain briefly how cyber war could unfold in that environment. The fear is that the Chinese would be able to use the internet to do a number of things, to disrupt our communication systems, to cause blackouts in the United States around key military installations in an attempt to hamper the movement of troops and supplies. They could interfere with military communication systems. They could interfere with civilian communication systems and just cause generalized chaos in the United States. In addition, in theater, there would be the obvious attempts to jam military communications in theater. But, the fear is that a worst-case scenario would be massive blackouts in the United States, a significant disruption to the civilian population that comes from the blackouts, a collapse of the telephone systems, the internet systems. And once some of these, for example, a piece of malware, which is a computer virus, essentially, once it's released, they can have unintended consequences, and they can be sort of difficult to corral, right? So it's not the kind of thing where you can stop it immediately. There's no unplugging in the United States from the internet that would allow the United States to defend itself by unplugging.
As you describe this, I think of the airline industry, the air traffic control system, a complex system that is highly vulnerable to disruption. It doesn't take much to create backups, not even around the country, around the world. We're talking about something similar here. Is it over-reliance on technology? Should we have more paper in play?
No, I don't think it's an over-reliance problem. I think what you're really looking at is if you think about the internet, right, and so much of this is really about the internet. The internet was created in the late 60s, and it was really began as a tool to allow scientists to collaborate with one another on behalf of the U.S. Department of Defense. And I think unexpectedly, there was this very widespread adoption of the internet as the backbone of almost all forms of communication today. That initial system was never designed to be highly secure, because it was really meant to be...
To the contrary, its strength was its openness. Right?
Exactly. And the U.S. government made good policy decisions to allow it to be open, to avoid over-regulating the use of the internet and the applications that the internet could be put to in order to foster economic development. And I think today it's fair to say the United States has benefited tremendously, economically, militarily, and in terms of just informing society and improving dialogue and the exchange of information globally. The United States has really benefited from this sort of open internet environment that it has fostered. What is happening now, though, is it's inevitable in human behavior. People who want to manipulate something have this is not necessarily a new development, but it's certainly becoming more serious all the time, have emerged, whether it's an individual, whether it's a criminal, or whether it's a nation state preparing for potential warfare in the future. All of those things, I think, have congealed today to give us a snapshot of an internet that has evolved as a useful platform, but probably hasn't evolved as a useful and very secure platform. And that's the evolution that I think we're really talking about today.
Along those lines, in the Cold War model, the mutually assured destruction. MAD was the deterrence model. Doesn't work in a case like this. A missile comes with a return address. A virus, a computer virus, does not.
It does not.
So what does work in this environment?
What works is I think, looking at the systems first that you need to have secure, right? The only way to be secure, if you're plugged into the internet, even if you have encryption, if you're plugged into the internet, you have vulnerability. So the first thing is deciding, is that vulnerability tolerable? And if it's not tolerable, say it's a highly sensitive, supercritical information system in the Department of Defense, for example, really the only way to fully protect that system is to unplug it. That is, you create a closed internet system. And even there, I think it's fair to say that that's not real security, because one of the interesting threats that's emerged over the past few years is the use of thumb drives, the data devices.
A famous event in 2008 involving the Pentagon. That's
right, and it's been written about by Undersecretary Lin in an article in Foreign Affairs, where he described briefly, that event. But but it's happened not only to the Department of Defense. It's happened to other companies. It's happened in relation to the Stuxnet virus. And basically, what it involves is loading a piece of malware on one of those drives and leaving them in a place where they could be picked up. And if they're picked up and if they're installed into even a computer that's in a detached network, suddenly that network could be compromised, right? So finding true security in this environment is an extremely elusive goal. So I think coming backwards, how secure does your most secure system need to be is really the starting point.
But you are describing a defensive posture. Offense has the advantage in cyberspace.
It has the advantage of, I think I liken it to, if you think about the enemy in Afghanistan or Iraq, this is a somewhat hard to find enemy. They look like the civilian population. They hide their weapons. They only gather their weapons and fight you when they choose. And I think in cybersecurity, and it's really kind of the same model. It's an asymmetrical threat that emerges at the time and place of its choosing. And to some extent, it leaves the United States in a defensive posture. And when I say the United States, I don't just mean the military. Right. I mean, it leaves a telecommunication provider in a defensive posture. It leaves the financial institutions in a defensive posture. And I think that's one of the really important distinctions when we're talking about cybersecurity, is the front, the war itself.
Not all warfare is directed at military targets.
Exactly. And, it's an unfortunate fact that in warfare today, you can certainly expect enemies to target whatever they think will be useful, and that includes the civilian infrastructure.
This is a difficult question to answer, I know, in advance, so I almost apologize for asking the question. But one of the things that happens in a discussion like this is we talk worst-case scenarios, and it becomes almost a fear-dominated exercise. What's your sense of how significant the threat is, and then is our response being accurately calibrated to the actual threat versus just the perception or the fear of the worst-case scenario?
Yes, I think that there is a tendency to try and act through the prism of the worst-case scenario. That's not entirely bad, because I think policymakers need to understand what the worst-case scenario is. I do think it's a mistake to use that as the only prism to look at this issue from. I mean, I think so. We talked about cyber warfare earlier and attacks that drop power grids and disrupt civilian infrastructure, air traffic control, and other systems that are linked to the internet. Probably a more pervasive threat, and one that is documented in the public domain, is cyber espionage, for example. And cyber espionage takes many forms, but there's a fascinating study on an attempt that has not been directly attributed to China, out of the Munk Center in Canada, where they looked at an espionage network that they called GhostNet. GhostNet was directed at the Dalai Lama and the Dalai Lama's and political activities against the Chinese government. And essentially what happened is the Munk Center was able to analyze sort of in real time this surveillance network that they called GhostNet, that had been implanted on the computer networks of political opposition in China that was based in Nepal. And through that analysis, they published an interesting report that probably provides one of the most useful looks at how something like that would work. So what they found was that the the purveyors of GhostNet, the operators of GhostNet, were able to, they were very intelligent, and they used malware that was sent in emails that were very carefully crafted to look like the kind of email that you or I would expect to get at work. So if it was here at the Wilson Center, it would be an email from me to you with an attachment and a title that said, agenda for, the upcoming seminar. And you would click on that, innocently enough. Right. And by clicking on that, you would get your document, and it would look authentic. But while you weren't really watching what was going on, it would be downloading some malware onto your computer that would essentially give a third-party control over your computer. It could control the microphone. It could control the camera if you had one on your computer. It could allow full access to all of the files that you have access to through your network here at the Wilson Center. And if you think about that capability in the U.S. government network, in a corporate network, maybe through an engineer who has broad access to sensitive intellectual property, the ability then to surreptitiously and without the knowledge of the owner of that computer and of the owner of that network, to just have free run of the system and to look at and download all kinds of sensitive information and essentially steal it and take it out of the country. I think that's one of the really pernicious threats that exists with respect to cybersecurity. It's not cyber warfare, but I think it has the very serious potential to undermine U.S. competitiveness in the long run. And if I were, I think U.S. corporations are rightly concerned about this. The U.S. government is rightly concerned about it, and I think that's an area, an example of where I would say, if I were to focus on a most likely threat scenario that's very serious.
And it's worth noting that this is not theoretical. This is already happening. Intellectual property is being stolen every day. It
is. And the difference today is, a long time ago, you'd have to have somebody, maybe you'd find somebody in a company that you could pay to steal information.
The old-fashioned way.
Exactly. And they would have to stand at the copier at night when no one was around, risk getting caught.
The risks of detection are greater.
Exactly. Now today, in some of these instances, these things happen, and terabytes of data have been reported to be stolen, unknown to the owner of that data. Over the course of a few days, weeks, months. And the amount of data that can be stolen in a short period of time is absolutely amazing.
I want to pick your attorney part of the brain a little bit on the issue of whenever you talk about security, you especially in a case of individual devices, or in a worst case scenario, say the president essentially declaring digital martial law and taking over private networks during an attack, the privacy comes into play. And the public versus private. Give us some thoughts, either general or specific, on what are the considerations when crafting effective cybersecurity strategy?
I think that the policy concerns are legitimate. That's the first thing I would say. They're not legitimate because somehow you use the government martial law scenario, which is the extreme. They're not legitimate because the government is bad or because the people who might implement a policy like that are bad or trying to spy on Americans. But I think America has a strong tradition and I think the way the internet has grown up in America, there's this sort of expectation that you have a degree of privacy on the internet. I think that assumption is one that is fading as a first thought, as you look at social networking. So I think when you think of privacy in the internet, I think you have to think of the specific user. How much am I allowing myself to be exposed to? How much of my personal information am I exposing? And therefore diluting my own privacy. But with respect to giving the government the ability to declare cyber martial law, or a proposal that's been made is to allow the government to track all internet traffic that comes into the United States and be able to see it and know where it comes from and know where it's going to. The concept of attribution. Right. One of the things that is lacking in the internet today is solid attribution, that is, to know where data comes from and where it goes to. Certainly cybersecurity or the security of the internet would be improved with greater attribution because it would be much more difficult to hide as a hacker, for example. So I think that the privacy concern is a valid one. I think eventually the privacy concerns are going to have to give way a little bit, frankly. To the need to increase security. And for government policymakers, that is, I think, a difficult balancing act. I will say that consistently through administrations, the need to protect and preserve the privacy of American citizens has been paramount. The Obama administration has made that one of their very significant features of their cybersecurity policy efforts. And I think that what you'll see is an effort and a struggle on the part of policymakers to balance the need to have security or greater security.
This almost seems to have
privacy.
I'm sorry to step on your last sentence
No.
there, Matt, but this almost seems to have cultural implications as much as policy or legal, in that our whole concept of what privacy is evolving in this new environment.
It is. And so that's sort of, I think, the bigger backdrop to the privacy issue with respect to cybersecurity. The much larger issue is privacy and the internet in general and its impact on privacy.
We only have a couple minutes left, and in that time, I'd like you to talk about, you represent the private sector. What is the level of cooperation between government and industry, foreign allies, in trying to come up with something that's cohesive and can work?
Well, so I want to say, one thing. I mean, my comments are not in the capacity of my private representation.
Right, you're not a spokesperson for Cisco.
Exactly.
Right.
They're really in the capacity of my Wilson Center Public Policy scholar hat is the one I have on now.
Scholars have much more latitude than corporate entities.
They do, or at least we like to think they do, right? The critical thing here is that the government and the private sector need to work very closely together. I mean, that's been an axiom all along. But I think that that's one area where there's a need for significant improvement. And it's the difficulty of the private sector that has its own equities to protect, and the government that has the national security interest. My view is that there's no distinction between the common interest here. Private corporations need security to support their businesses, to protect their investors, and to protect their customers. The government needs the same security to protect its infrastructure. And I think the hope is that common ground can provide the basis for the kind of cooperation that's going to be necessary in the near future to really secure America's information infrastructure.
I'm going to cling to that statement on common ground, since that's been in short supply in this town for a while. So
I'm an optimist.
Matt, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thanks very much.
I want to thank you for listening and watching as well, and let you know we'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.